All right, everybody, today we're doing another deep dive video topic, and the topic as chosen by the people over at Instagram is my personal top 10 lifts for hypertrophy. So the way that I want to do this video is obviously, nobody can do just 10 lifts for their whole life and get the best progress possible. So the way that I want to frame this is I want to pick the lifts that have the greatest longevity in your career, meaning that you could use them as a beginner and you could use them if you're super advanced. Okay, these are lifts that could be there and give you the most bang for your buck, set per set, on a set per set basis compared to other movements, regardless of your training status or anything else. So that's how I'm going to frame it. Now let's talk a little bit about criteria for selection before I just get straight into the list. The number one thing that I personally look for in a hypertrophy lift is progressive overloadability. And it's obviously not a real word, but what I'm talking about is, does this movement have a long runway for progression? And is it easily loadable, especially incrementally? So for example, dumbbell exercises can be absolutely awesome at various stages of your development, but many gyms have limited selections in terms of dumbbells, and at home gyms it can even be worse. Oftentimes commercial gyms will top out at, say, 120-pound dumbbells, which is like 55 kgs, or they'll top out at 150-pound dumbbells, which is roughly like 70 kgs. And for a lot of people, that will be fine on plenty of exercises. But even if you don't ever top out the dumbbells, and many enhanced lifters will, they aren't incrementally loadable, meaning that you have to go up in big increments. Oftentimes you have to go up in 2.5 kilo increments or 5-pound increments, and that can be a tough jump to make. So for me, that actually will take precedence over whether or not a lift might be better in other technical ways, because it doesn't have as long of a runway for progression and it's not as easily to overload. So overloadability is the number one thing that I look for in a lift if we're talking about the king hypertrophy lifts, lifts that are good for beginners, lifts that are good for advanced people, lifts that you can keep in for years at a time and keep progressing. The second thing that I'm looking for from a hypertrophy perspective is simplicity and stability. And that might sound like two separate things, but the way that I think of them, they're completely intertwined. So for example, a free weight squat can be an excellent way to train your legs, but there's no universe in which a free weight squat is as simple as, say, a hack squat. And that's because a hack squat has you on a fixed path. It blocks your hips from moving backward. So all you have to do is get on the hack squat and squat. When you're doing barbell squats, if you want to emphasize your quads, you really need to think about what you're doing. Okay, you have to focus on keeping your hips forward, because for a lot of people, as soon as the movement gets hard, their strong hip extensors are going to want to contribute or even take over. And when your hips shoot back, now you're pulling in tons of adductor, more glute, etc. And the goal was quads. Those two things are actually interlinked, because the reason why you don't have to think about that, the reason why it's simpler on a hack squat is because of the stability of the back pad. You can think of this in other ways, for example, on curls. Say you are doing incline curls, right? And on the incline curl, you might want to think about how far forward your elbow is coming, because if you're bringing in shoulder flexion, you can be using a lot of front delt and taking away work from the bicep. Whereas if you're doing a preacher curl, for example, as long as you're keeping your elbow on the pad, there's really no way for your shoulder to take over or contribute unnecessarily. So it's both more stable and more simple, and those two reasons are interlinked. The third thing that I'm looking for is, does this movement train the target muscle at longer muscle lengths, and even does it actually stretch the target muscle? We know that stretching in and of itself is hypertrophic. So movements that provide a stretch to the target muscle on a set per set basis can be excellent. However, again, this is only the third criteria for me, because we all know people that have gotten super jacked from movements, say like a barbell squat, a deadlift, a barbell bench press, and these are not movements that are technically full range of motion that provide some sort of a huge stretch. You have to do them in very particular ways, like you have to do, a heels elevated ATG squat to really stretch your quads, and even then it's not going to happen for some people. And for a deadlift, you're going to have to do it from a deficit, or maybe do some sort of a stiff leg or RDL variation. Otherwise, you're not going to get a big stretch on your hamstrings. So just because something stretches, to me, that doesn't make it better. Like, I'm not going to choose a fly variation over a chest press variation on a top 10 list for the other reasons that I've listed. Stability and progressive overloadability. You will always have the ability to get way freaking stronger on a chest press variation, and because of that, it has more potential to get you huge. Huge. The last thing that I'm looking at, and this is truly the least important factor by a very, very long shot, by a big margin, is the strength curve of the movement. Now, what does that mean? Strength curve is where the movement is hardest or easiest. So if I say that something has an ascending strength curve, a movement has an ascending strength curve, that means it's actually going to get harder as you get closer to lockout. If it has a descending strength curve, that means it actually gets easier as you get towards finishing the movement, getting the muscle short. This is important because there has been plenty of research come out lately that has pointed to the fact that it's not just about whether a movement trains something at a long muscle length, but also where in the movement does it have the most tension. For example, a recent study done comparing directly preacher curls versus incline curls found that preacher curls actually provided more hypertrophy on a set per set basis, even though they had less stretch, probably because they're more stable and they have most of their tension in the bottom position, whereas depending on how much of an incline you have when you're doing incline curls, most of the tension is going to be halfway up when your arm is parallel to the ground, or even closer to the fully short position, again, depending on the level of incline that you have. Not only that, but if something has a strength curve that matches either the movement or the muscles involved in the movement more closely, it's just a little bit easier to progress. A good example of this would be a barbell row. Barbell rows are super easy at the bottom compared to your muscular potential versus in that last, 2 or 3 inches of range of motion. If you stop doing a barbell row, once you can't touch your chest, some people can do another 5, 6, 7 reps where they get like within 4 inches of lockout. So having a movement where the strength curve is matched well to the muscles involved makes it easier to progress, and it gives you a better stimulus on a set per set basis. So those are my big 4 criteria. Progressive overloadability. Can you get super strong on this movement? Plain and simple. Can you make small weight jumps? 2, is it simple? You have to have a really complicated technique. You have to think about it a lot. And is it stable? So simplicity and stability. Can you just get on the thing and try really hard? That's a huge key. 3, does it train the muscle at a long muscle length? Does it stretch the muscle? Right? Like for example, leg extensions, they don't stretch the quads at all, but something like a sissy squat will provide a huge stretch on the quads. This is a factor in exercise selection, especially on a set per set basis where we're trying to do a top 10 list, where we're picking other exercises over another exercise. Obviously in real life we might do both because they have different benefits, but on a top 10 list you have to crown a king or a queen, and you need criteria to pick that king or queen. Last one I look at, and this is the one that a lot of people get obsessed with, but it's probably the least important on this list by a real fair margin, and that would be strength curve. Where is the movement the hardest and where is it the easiest? Does it match the muscle's strength curve or the movement strength curve very well to make it easier for you to progress and to have most of that tension in that lengthened stretch position so that you get more hypertrophy on a set per set basis? So with that said, those are the 4 criteria that I'm going to be using to evaluate exercises for the rest of the video. So without further ado, let's talk about the first exercise.